chapter 3, verse 30 through 31. Seeing it is one God, which shall justify the circumcision by faith and uncircumcision through faith, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yea, we establish the law. Paul is saying, so does having faith in the Messiah or believing in why he came and died void out our obligation to keep the commandments? God forbid. That means no. Paul is saying just because the Messiah was sent doesn't mean the law goes away. So we know that sin is defined by the law. The law tells us what sin is. In Romans 3:20 it says, in the end, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. We see it again in chapter 4, verse 15, for where no law is, there is no transgression. Again in chapter 5, verse 13, there may have been evil prior to the law, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. So without the law, we have no idea what sin is. That means without the law, we have no idea what's acceptable or unacceptable to the Most High. So we left off in part 1 with the question to think about. And the question was, if sin is defined by the law, how do we keep from sinning without the law? This is what your Sunday school Bible study should be teaching you. It's a rhetorical question. If the law tells you what a sin is, and someone is saying, don't keep sinning, the only way for you to know what not to do is to read the commandments. This is what Romans chapter 6 is about. I'm taking you through these chapters because I'm tired of people pulling a couple of verses out to try and prove the law is no longer. You cannot understand Paul with a fragment of his passage. His writing style is complicated. You have to read everything in its context. Looking at chapter 6, it's not enough for us to believe that we have dominion over sin. That's a Christian thought. Just believe you have dominion over sin. You actually have to do something or not do something. It's a fallacy that your works are completely ineffective. You do have to do something. This is why Christians are so confused as to what to do and what not to do. When you throw away the commandments, you're clueless as to what to do. And this is to be expected. Again, how do we keep from sinning if you've thrown away the manual that tells you what a sin is? So follow me through chapter 6. Paul says in verse 6, knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should serve sin no more. Verse 11, reckon ye also yourselves to be dead indeed to sin. Verse 12, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in the lusts thereof. He's telling you not to serve sin. Again, no way to accomplish this without the law, telling you what the Most High standard is. Christian, why would Paul instruct you to do something, but tell you the means by which to achieve it is no longer needed? Why would Paul instruct you to do something, but tell you the means by which to achieve it is no longer needed? That's like a football coach telling his team to go out there and win, but not coaching them or giving them the rule book or the plays by which they should win. What does it mean to be under grace, not under the law? Because Christians say this all the time. So let's look at Romans 6:14. It says, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. Verse 15, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? God forbid. Understand Paul's audience, who he's speaking to. The church at Rome was primarily made up of Gentile converts who were never under the law. So they're a part of that remnant that follow the Most High via grace. Now that being said, does that mean forget about the law and sin? Forget about the standard of the Most High that's already been set and given to his people? Paul says, God forbid. How do we avoid sin without the manual that defines it? It's not possible. See, whether or not you're an Israelite or a Gentile, the law is the Most High standard. It doesn't matter who it was originally given to. It is his expectation if you intend to represent him. See, Christians, they see themselves as independent contractors. They want to represent him, but they don't want the responsibility. They want to work for him, but they don't want to do what he says to do. If you actually want to be employed by the Most High, you must do as he says do. You cannot operate independently of that. Verse 18, it says, they were made free from sin. How can we be free from sin if we are committing it? Don't we hear the preacher preach this all the time? You are made free, and whom the Son sets free is free indeed, right? Heard it a million times, and so have you. It's true. We don't have to be bound by sin, but many of us are. And Paul speaks of the possibility or the hope that we not be bound by it. In other words, the door is open. You're free to leave the jail cell if you want. That doesn't mean we actually get up and walk out of the prison. It's more than just believing we're free because the Son set us free. It takes acts of doing, commitment to doing the right acts. Let me give you another example. When you enter into a dark room and the light doesn't automatically turn on, you have to find the light switch. Turn the switch up. The light comes on and the darkness leaves. Grace doesn't stop you from having to put forward some action. If you want the light to come on, you have to flip the switch. If you want to avoid sin, you have to keep the commandments that tell you what those sins are. It's not about righteous acts being like filthy rags. It's about doing what it takes to sustain your righteousness, because a Gentile can call himself righteous all day and night. If you're going around robbing and stealing from people, your righteousness went out the door a long time ago. It takes actions or preventive measures to sustain righteousness. It's not just about grace. This is a hard pill to swallow for you Christians out there, but truth nonetheless. You know how many drug addicts, food addicts, alcoholics, sex addicts, Christian people who still have to go to rehab to learn the tools to deal with their addiction. It's real. Nothing just goes away. You must do something. Whatever that something is, you must do some act in order to sustain your righteousness. This is why you get frustrated when the preacher tells you you're free and you go home and you're still tempted to commit the same destructive acts. And then you want to get mad at God because you can't stop. You must put your best foot forward to overcome struggle and adversity. Let me tell you what grace means. It means a stone is not waiting to be thrown at you for doing what you're doing. Judgment, as it was known in the biblical days, has become forgiveness of the Most High and mercy. But welcome to the real world, because if the police find you doing something the law says you shouldn't be doing, guess what? You're going to do some time. The real world has laws. The Most High has laws too. The difference is the Most High has forgiveness in a world where there is none. Christianity has created a false reality for you where there is no law and there is nothing holding you accountable. But if you want to be delivered, you must put forth some action. Same thing for you Israelites out there. Believing the law is over with. Your covenant is over with. To be chosen is one thing. Chosen without obedience is another. And if you're chosen but you fail to be obedient, you might as well throw your Bible away, because you've thrown your covenant away. So why read the Bible? So again, Paul is saying just because the Messiah was sent doesn't mean the law goes away. The question was, if sin is defined by the law, how do we keep from sinning without the law? The answer is we can't. It is impossible. If we desire to avoid sin, we must keep the commandments. So we're finally moving on to Romans 7, which is another misunderstood passage. I had a young lady throw Romans 7 at me as proof that the law is done away with. And I simply told her, thank you for inspiring my next video, because she did. This video is well overdue. But let's look at Romans 7, because many Christians misinterpret it also. Romans 7 verse 1 through 3. Know ye not, brethren, how the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives? For the woman which has a husband is bound by the law to her husband, so long as he lives. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. Verse 3, so then if, while her husband lives, she be married to another, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So Paul is giving you an introduction to all he's about to say in chapter 7. You can't read verse 1 through 3 and think you know what he's about to talk about. You have to read it all. So Paul gives an example of how a law has dominion over a man or a woman by comparing it to a marriage. And he basically says only death breaks the marital union. But he goes a step further. He says she would have been considered an adulteress, but because of the death of her husband, she is no longer subject to that judgment. His focus is on the death of the husband and how that death broke the connection that woman had to him. But his focus is also on what kind of woman she was, worthy of judgment. But the death broke a connection, and now she is no longer worthy of that judgment. Okay, get that. So Paul is not talking about the law here. He's talking about two things: a death and how that death affects judgment. Paul is not talking about the law. His focus is on what death does to the law. He's about to show you how the death of the Messiah has broken us from a connection we have to the law, a connection that Paul clearly shows is a connection of judgment. He goes on to say in verse 4, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that you should be married to another. So we're talking about death to a connection man has with the law by way of the body of the Messiah in order to connect to a new thing. So the death of the Messiah is the focus here. It did something to the covenant. It made us dead to part of the covenant, and it connected us to something new. Just as the death of that woman's husband disconnected her from a law judging her. But what connection is Paul referring to? That's the question of the day. When he says, we've become dead to the law by the body of the Messiah. What does that mean? Because the body of the Messiah in death represents the sacrifice of all the lambs we put up to atone for sin. The Messiah became that ultimate sacrifice. That's what his body represents, the ultimate sacrifice for our sin. And when he died, grace and mercy entered into the covenant. Look at Jeremiah 31. It prophesies this forgiveness entering into the covenant for the nation. So when the Messiah died, mercy and grace entered into the covenant for us. We were once stoned to death for sinning, put to death for falling short of the law. Now forgiveness resides where death once did. So when Paul says in verse 4, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that you should be married to another, he's referring to the part of the law that the body of the Messiah addressed. He's not referring to the entire law, but the part the body of the Messiah addressed. And that is the judgment of the law for sin, the punishment issued for sin as defined by the law. That's the part that we are now dead to. Pay attention. There's a reason Paul specified, quote unquote, by the body. Now we must know what his body represented. He was a lamb, and the lamb addressed not the entire law, but the breaking of the law, the sin, the resulting judgment and punishment. So we're not talking about the entire law, but the judgment portion of the law. Okay, let's move on to verse 5. When we were in the flesh, the motions of sins, which were by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. Now, motions of sins, which were by the law, means our actions as defined by the law, which brought forth death. So sinful actions as defined by the law that led to death. That's what verse 5 means. And those acts brought punishment. Verse 6, but now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in the newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. Now, if you stop there, it appears as if Paul is telling you the law is a problem, has been a problem, and therefore it's done away with. This is Christianity's interpretation in a nutshell. Christianity is going to tell you that the law is over, it's done away with, it's no longer. We're delivered from it, it brought forth death in us, it's old, it's over. But this scripture means that the law which brought forth death, we are now delivered from it. Pay very close attention to what he's saying. Key part of the sentence in verse 5, the sins brought forth fruit unto death. Our motions of sins which brought forth fruit unto death. Whatever sin Paul is talking about in this sentence, it brought forth fruit unto death. He's referring to the ultimate death, judgment, the punishment that came because of the sin. Whatever that sin was, it resulted in death. Verse 6 says, now we're delivered from the law. The question is, what law? The law of Moses or another law? He says the law that held us to death. He says the law that being dead wherein we were held. The law Paul is referring to is not the entire law of Moses, but the law that resulted in the punishment of death as a result of sin. The law of sin and death. The body of Christ, the body of the Messiah in his death, has taken the place of our death in judgment. We're talking about his body, which was sacrificed for our redemption. Paul's focus here is not on the law. It's on the judgment portion of the law. How do I know this? Because of the 50,000 other places where Paul has clearly upheld the law. If you haven't seen part 1 of this video, please take the time to view it. Now, this is my interpretation of verse 6. But now we're delivered from the law. What law? The law that defined what should lead to death and punishment, in order to serve in newness of spirit, which is under grace, mercy, and forgiveness, and not the oldness of the letter, which was the part of the law that brought forth judgment, death. So, did the death of the Messiah erase the law? No, it erased the judgment that came when the law was broken. How do I know this? Go over to Matthew 5:17, when the Messiah himself told you, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Christian, you've been trained to think the word fulfill means abolish. But if you read verse 19, which your pastor will never lead you to, the Messiah goes on to say, anyone who does not keep the commandments and teaches others not to do so is considered the least in the kingdom. So you don't need a long-winded passage from Paul to tell you what to do. Like I said, everything we need to do to uphold the Most High standard was already written in the Old Testament. Keep the commandments. Keep the commandments. If you're an Israelite, keep the commandments because they are a part of your everlasting covenant and they are the Most High standard. If you're not an Israelite, you should respect the fact that the laws are indeed the Most High standard, regardless of who you are and where they originally were given, and keep those commandments. Why? If you're not an Israelite, because they are the Most High standard of righteousness, regardless of who they were given to. And if you intend to follow after him, that is the way you must do it. There is no other way. Having faith in the Messiah, the one you call Jesus, means believing in what he stood for, and why he came, and why he died. The question is, what did he stand for? And as I stated in Matthew 5:17, he stood for the commandments. He points to the law. He points to the Most High. He didn't bring you a new religion. He didn't omit the commandments. All he did was sacrifice himself as a lamb for the remission of the sins of the past. Now we're forgiven. Now there's mercy and grace. That's it. He didn't change anything else. That's Old Testament, and it still stands. Now that was the hard part. When we get to Romans 7, verse 7, Paul switches gears a little bit. Let's read on to verse 7, because the question now is, was it really the law that brought forth sin and death or judgment, or is it the work of our members, our flesh that Paul is talking about that led to death under the law? What's at fault here? Is it the punishment of the law, or is it really us? We're also going to run into some more scriptures where Paul upholds the law. So I do like this transition Paul takes. He turns the attention away from the punishment the law brought to the struggle within us. The true problem is not the judgment or the punishment that the Messiah saved us from. It's actually our own personal weakness and inability to commit to keeping the commandments. That's the problem. Now, Christians, don't turn me off now. This is the part you need to hear. Romans 7:7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. I had not known sin, but by the law. So here Paul is telling you the law defines sin. It tells us what a sin is. Thus the law is a good thing. We wouldn't know what not to do if it were not for a law in place telling us not to do it. Mannerisms such as lust that get us into trouble, that typically lead us down the wrong path, we wouldn't even recognize them as problematic if it were not for a commandment telling us indeed this behavior here is problematic. So if the law tells us what is not acceptable to the Most High, right, that's what Paul is saying here. He cannot possibly be against it, lest he be against the Most High. The law tells us what is not acceptable to the Most High. Therefore, it is good. So first we need to be clear that Paul is not anti-law. He's for the law. So what is it then that Paul is trying to say is problematic when it comes to the law? Let's go on to verse 8. He said in verse 8, sin, taken occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. What is concupiscence? It means a strong desire, a strong desire. That means that sin, the forbidden act as defined by the commandments, brings about a strong desire to do it. Paul is saying the very fact that there is a rule, the law, that tells me of a forbidden act, a sin, it makes me want to do it more. Pay close attention to his words. The problem is not the rule. The problem is how the rule makes us respond. So far we know from verse 7 that, number one, the law is not forbidden, according to Paul, but indeed the law tells us right from wrong. And number two, we also know that according to Paul in verse 8, that the forbidden acts that the law defines causes us to be tempted to commit the sin anyway. When you tell me what not to do, it makes me want to do it. That's what Paul is saying here. So far, the problem is not the law. It's how we as humans react to it. He goes on to say in verse 8, for without the law, sin was dead. This means that nothing was forbidden when there was no law. Sin was dead means nothing held us accountable. We could do what we wanted, and the idea of anything being forbidden was dead. The idea of sin was dead. It didn't exist. Order, standards, they were dead too, because without unacceptable acts being defined, there was no such thing as acceptable or unacceptable. For without the law, the idea of sin was dead. Now, to the Christians out there who may be listening to this video, is that something you think Paul perceives as a good thing? The idea of sin or forbidden behaviors no longer existing? After he's told us not to allow sin to reign in our mortal bodies in chapter 6, verse 12, do you think Paul was for sin not being defined? He spoke highly of the law in Romans 7:7, saying the law defined sin. Why would he denounce the law in Romans 7:8 when he says, for without law, sin is dead? Paul was not against the law. He's saying without the accountability of the law, we could do no wrong. Number 3, the third belief we now know of Paul is that to him, it was a bad thing that sin is dead, that there is no law that defines it. Forbidden acts no longer being defined as forbidden. It's a bad thing, according to Paul in verse 8. What we do see so far is one problem Paul had with the law, and it is this, that according to verse 8, it makes us want to break it. It's in our human nature to be tempted by restraints. Laws tempt us to want to bend the rules. Read verse 8 again. It says, but sin, taken occasion by the commandment, or defined by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of strong desire. In other words, the fact that this act has been defined by the law as forbidden, that makes me want to break it. Imagine a child running all over the house, jumping off the walls, tearing up the furniture, breaking stuff, writing on the floors, climbing on the counters, doing whatever his or her little heart desires, and having fun doing it. No rules in place. That child is having a field day. No discipline. No daddy telling him what to do. And for some of you, this is what your church looks like on Sunday morning. This is us without commandments. No law in place. No rules. No standards. And then all of a sudden, daddy walks through the door and says, all right, sit down. No more running through the house. You will walk. No more jumping on the furniture. Furniture is made for sitting. We don't write on walls. We don't sit on counters. We don't scream indoors, so on and so forth. Daddy's laying down the ground rules. Little kid is sitting there on the couch listening. And what is the first thing most kids do when you tell them what not to do? They do it anyway. They push the envelope. They want to test you. And it's not just with kids. Some of us on our jobs, when the boss tells you you only get 2 10-minute breaks, we come back in 12 just to see what will happen. We take an extra 5 minutes, come up with an excuse. So I had to use the bathroom. What are you going to do? Fire me because I had to use the bathroom? When we know good and well we really didn't have to go. We just wanted to push the envelope. It's part of our human nature to bend the rules. This is what Paul is talking about in Romans 7:8. So that's the effect rules have on us. That's the only problem with the law, according to Paul. Note, the law is not the problem. The effect the law has on us, we see so far, is the problem. He's talking about how we respond to rules. Be clear on that. So before the rules, there was no threat to me. But put the rule up, and now I'm tempted to commit a sin. Go on to verse 9, and he says, "For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died." Again, a Christian will look at that and assume the law is the problem here, because when the standard was lifted, he died. But look at it. The idea of being alive is being compared to being without someone telling you what to do and what not to do. You're alive, meaning you're free to do whatever you want without the threat of judgment or discipline. He's saying when the law came, he died. Now the idea of death is being compared to constraint. A standard's in place telling me if I do this, then that will happen. If I break this rule, discipline will be in order. Now that a rule is in place, death is in order when I break it. Without the rule, I'm alive, meaning I can do whatever I want. Get that? With the rule now comes accountability. Now if you do that, there's punishment, there's judgment. And that punishment and judgment is what Paul compares to death. There's a consequence now with that rule up. Is this a bad thing, according to Paul? Given he's already told you the law is not forbidden. Given he's already told you the law tells us what's acceptable and what is not. Clearly, when Paul says, "I died," he's referring to the effects of that accountability, not the accountability itself. What is he saying? He's saying the law itself is not the problem. The effects the law brings has been the problem. Keep in mind what he's already said of the law, highly regarded it. Remember that. So he's not denouncing it now. He's referring to what happens as a result of it. He's talking not about the law, but the judgment it brings. Christians will tell you the law in this passage leads you to death or eternal damnation. Paul is not referring to the law itself. He's referring to the judgment that comes from breaking it as a result of the accountability it brings now. So here's what Paul is expressing in Romans 7. Number 1, the law is not forbidden. It defines sin. Number 2, the law tempts us to want to bend the rules. Number 3, it's actually a bad thing that without law, sin is dead, because the law defines sin. Number 4, the law brings with it accountability, and the judgment of that accountability, that discipline, is equated to death. That's the punishment accountability brings with it. He's telling you the truth when it comes to the law. I could get away with anything before the law. I was alive. Now that the law stands, I died. That's the threat of judgment Paul is talking about. I just want you to fully understand as I'm taking you through this passage. So many Christians want to sum up the entire thing under one umbrella. You can't do that. Paul's saying a lot, and you have to take it all in and decipher exactly what he's getting at after you've taken it all in. So that's what we're doing. We're taking it all in. So going on to verse 10 through 13, we see Paul expanding on that judgment, that accountability, the effect the law causes on us because of its accountability now. It's going to sound a lot like he resents it. He says in verse 10, "And the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death." He's saying here is this law which is supposed to guide us. It's supposed to be a good thing for us, directing us, defining acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Yet along with it comes this punishment of death. I can't do what I want, and if I do, the punishment is death. That's how serious the Most High was and is about his standard. Verse 11 through 13 says, "For sin, taken occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me." Verse 12, "Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good." Here again, Paul speaks highly of the law, just in case you forgot how he felt about it. And then he says in verse 13, "Was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid, but sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful." He's dealing with the dilemma we face that a good law produces bad results, being the discipline. Wouldn't our kids say the same? The rules are up. Don't do this, don't do that. I chastise my kids because I love them. But if you break the rule, there is chastisement in order. So the dilemma Paul presents is common sense to all of us, that something set forth to bring order also brings with it punishment. So he's still talking about judgment. Then he goes from talking about the judgment of the law to talking about human nature again. Verse 14, it says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin." Verse 15, "For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that I do." Again, as humans, we're tempted when presented with constraints. It's in our human nature. You present me with the rule, and I want to break it. Paul is saying, I don't allow what I do. And what I do allow for some reason, I don't do. And I find myself doing what I hate. It's the struggle we all face and need self-discipline for. Now, again, is the law the problem? Or is the self the problem? Paul is pointing to the self. Verse 12, he upholds the law as holy, just, and good. He's talking about the fault in himself to uphold the law, not the fault in the law. Remember that. So this ties into the second belief of Paul, in that there is a problem with the human condition in our failure to uphold the law at all cost. So at no point do we actually see Paul denouncing the law itself. So let's go on to verse 16. And it says, "If then I do which I would not, I consent unto the law that is good." Verse 17, "Now then, it is no more that I do it, but sin that dwell in me." Verse 18, "For I know that in me dwells no good thing. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not." Again, that dilemma of the human nature. The very fact that I'm doing what I'm not supposed to means I've consented to it. And verse 17 is saying it's no longer about what I'm doing. Those forbidden actions have now become a part of who I am. Sin dwells in me. He says in verse 18, "In me dwells no good thing." He's talking about how our actions become a part of who we are. The law defined a sin, which in our very act of committing it defines who we are as a person. He's talking about the progression of the act we commit and how it defines who we are in time. So we see another belief of Paul, the belief that sinful acts become a part of who we are. Verse 19 says, "For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do." Sounds a lot like verse 15, "I do what I don't want to, and what I want to, I don't do." Same stuff. He's talking about the flaw in human nature, the difficulty in being obedient to the law. The flaw is in us. Verse 20, he says, "Now if I do that I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me." Again, the process of sin defining you, dwelling in you. Now he's saying that is no longer him making the decisions, but the sin in him. So that sin has taken over within. Verse 21, he says, "I find then a law, that when I would do good, evil is present with me. For I delight in the law of the Most High after the inward man." When he says a law, he's referring to a principle. And when he says the law, he's referring to the commandments. He finds a law or a principle where one could have both good and bad within. He's talking about the internal conflict of good and evil being within us. And because of this, he says he delights in the law of the Most High after the inward man, which he infers is now a law that understands the fact that one could will to do good, although his actions are the opposite. Paul is saying he delights in a law that understands his inward man. What is he really talking about? He's talking about mercy and grace and forgiveness, because a law that overlooks sinful acts for goodwill is a law that contains mercy and grace. This is what Paul is talking about, mercy and grace and forgiveness. It takes us back to the renewed covenant of Jeremiah 31, where we're told forgiveness would come into the covenant. Not erase it, but enter into it. So Paul is touching on the beauty of that forgiveness and really the need for it because of the human condition and nature that causes us to fall short time after time. Keep in mind, while Paul is introducing mercy and grace, he has not denounced the law at all. Christians out there who have thrown this passage at me to try and prove to me that the law is done away with, try again. He says in verse 23, "But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members." Again, principles. Paul sees a principle of his body which does bad, which conflicts the principle of his mind, which seeks to do good. And he is thereby brought into captivity, or is under the control of the law of sin, or principle of sin within his body. Again, human nature causes us to do the opposite of what we desire. You can call it human nature, you can call it self-discipline. Either way, your mind seeks to do one thing and your actions seek to do another. Verse 24, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death?" This conflict within, this good versus evil within me. This is real talk, real life for all of us. We all face this condition. But I tell you what, this is not. This is not Paul denouncing the law because it's too hard to keep. Again, this is Paul making certain that while you're aware of this difficult human condition of temptation and lack of self-discipline, you understand the law is indeed a definer of appropriate and inappropriate behavior. It is a definer of the Most High standard. It is good. It is holy and just. He's appreciating in verse 21 the forgiveness of the Most High coming into the law because of our flaws as human beings. He says he delights in it, a law that understands our inward man. He didn't say he delights in the idea of there being no law. He delights in a law that is after our inward man. He at no point denounces the law. If anything, he denounces lack of self-discipline, the flaw of human nature, the weakness of human nature to not do what we will to do at times. Christians who have taken this passage to mean the law is bad have misunderstood the character of man and our perception of the law, how it makes us want to misbehave in its very existence, and our inability to keep the law is the human condition Paul refers to in Romans 7. Perhaps maybe even he's touching on the fear we have of the law. Maybe we don't believe we can keep it. Feels like a death to have to keep it. We're no longer alive now that this rule is up. We're dying. Perhaps maybe that's why Christianity has failed to keep the commandments, have written off the laws, and taken Romans 7, twisted it to fit their own agenda. But the scripture is clear here. So what is Paul's resolution to this dilemma? He concludes in verse 25. He says, "I thank the Most High through the Messiah. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of the Most High, but with the flesh the law of sin." He continues to serve the law of the Most High, although it may at times only be in his mind while he commits sin, and his flesh still war against him. He resolves to be obedient anyway. He doesn't find ways to omit the law from the Bible. His resolution is to keep the commandments, no matter what it feels like, no matter the temptation. So to you Christians out there who say it is not possible to keep the laws, to some of you Hebrews who say the same, I urge you to follow in the way of Paul's resolution in Romans 7:25, that no matter how difficult it may become, you seek to keep the commandments the Most High has set up as a standard for you to follow him. And that is all I have for you today. I want to thank you for sticking with me on this video. I know it was a little extensive, but I pray it sheds some light on the subject of Paul's take on the law. Thank you all for watching. This is Judiah. Shalom.